I don't want to be called a doctor because I don't think I fit into the bracket of academia, but what has happened over the last couple of years, I think we have designed a bit of a recipe that could serve maybe as some kind of a model and how things could be done in a very topsy-turvy country that I think you cannot replicate anywhere else in the world. So when it comes to planning, I thought that in writing my PhD, I can contribute to what I believe was a big gap in my experience in Port Elizabeth or Nelson Mandela Bay between what urban planning is all about and what makes economic and social sense in a very, very difficult country in trying to fulfill into the needs of the built environment and how people see that built environment. I think there is a huge gap between what the public sector wants and how the private sector see things, and also how academia can contribute to it. And I think one of the reasons why we're battling these days is because the gap between the private sector and academia, public sector and academia, is quite big. And I think if one can close that gap through a special mechanism, and I think our company needs an effort in that direction, then I think one could find more joy in creating a built environment that can respond to what is the social and economic needs out there. Now, we're living some dreadful times at the moment. I don't think we all realize how deep the recession still is. And I think we all wonder how long this recession will still last. But one thing is for sure, and that is that the world will be a very different place after this recession. I think the kind of very sophisticated islands we had the last 10 years before the recession, I think will disappear for some time. I think very sophisticated islands of waterfronts and so forth, I think is something of the past for quite a long time. And we need to respond to that market, and I think urban planning and architecture is, are some disciplines that are going through a fundamental change and will be going through a change to respond to that economic and social needs out there. Now, if we look at the real estate clock at the moment, we're still sitting there at the bottom at number 60, battling the hell to get out of there. And I think although we had some positive signs over the last couple of months, maybe to a year, we're still struggling. And I think that the whole build up towards the stage of recovery, and again to what is, to be believed, the boom market, we're still very, very far away from it. And again, I want to emphasize that I think the world will be a very, very different place after this recession. And I think the disciplines of particularly urban planning will have to go through a metamorphosis, if one would call that, to actually respond to that urban economic and social needs out there. Just a bit in how we do things, and I think this little conference or big conference or get together is quite important. I think that that participation and dialogue and cooperation between the private sector, the public sector and academia is important. I think it's been quite lacking, particularly in this city. So although I'm trying to show a picture that is a bit harsh, but what we have done from our side is to try and close that gap between what the public sector thinks about things, the private sector wants in terms of profit, and our academia see their role in the future. This is probably my most important slide, and I'm very, very critical here, and I apologize, but it's a bit of a Dutch attitude towards things. I think it's sometimes better to be honest than to beat around the bush. So in South Africa, we have planning in a very different way. We seem to occupy first, then we build, then we put in the service, and then we say, oh dear, maybe we should do some town planning. But in a way, it should be the other way around. And sometimes we miss a step or two. We allow the occupation of building to happen, and then the planning becomes a bit of a fruitless exercise. Now, in my view, planning is an extremely important discipline. I still don't know what it really is. And even after doing a PhD in economics and planning, I still don't know what it is. But planning, in my view, is an extremely strong economic tool. It can actually change society. Urban planning and regional planning becomes a breeding ground for architects and urban designers to operate in. So the planners almost start with point A, and then the urban designers and the architects actually follow suit. So planning in South Africa is a very linear, legal way of doing things, very boxy. They look at legislation, they apply it to the letter. Where planning should be very much a creative tool, a very innovative tool to create the kind of social economic impact that we desperately need. Just a bit about Port Elizabeth, and then going back to how does one close that gap between the private sector, the public sector, and academia. I honestly think Port Elizabeth has seen some of the worst urban decay of all South African cities. And our job was simple 7 years ago, try and fix what seems to be completely unfixable. And I believe that an interventionist approach had to be followed to try and I don't want to use the word, it sounds a bit harsh again, to force urban planners to think differently about what to do. In a way, we were lucky with the recession arriving because that sort of made people sit back and say, oh dear, we have to do things a bit differently. We have to do urban planning and architecture a bit differently. We need to start responding to the customer needs out there. We're not living in a Western country, although we still try and do things in a very Western way. We have to respond to that social economic needs out there. So in a way, what we've been doing in the Mandela Bay Development Agency was to create a very strong intersection, and I don't think we've been particularly successful, but I think we're trying to get that intersection between economic development and urban planning, something that I found in my own naivety has been completely missing in the initial stages of our work. And I think it's got a far-reaching effect on the discourse of urban management and planning. So, in a way, we've developed a bit of a third way, an alternative way to try and get that focal point between the private sector, the public sector, and academia. And that's to move away from that rational, linear structure of urban planning to an interactive governance of planning and development. It's difficult though, because you're dealing with municipal officials that are good people, that are well-trained people, but they just don't think that way. Now you can either be confrontational and lose your friends and make a lot of enemies, or you can do what my board chairman, Sake Matsholoma, always says, he calls it cooperative confrontation. And you need to confront people with that different way to respond to that big market need out there. It's not a Western country, it's an African country, and we need to start doing ways, following interventionist ways that maybe is a different way that we've done it in the past. So I think there needs to be a very collaborative approach between the state, academia, and the private sector. And I must say, I think that our little company have tried to bridge those great gaps between the private sector, the public sector, and academia. We work well with the university, we work well with the public sector, we are half the public sector, and I think it's important for us to do the work in such a way that the private sector responds. But the private sector cannot just respond to make a big profit. The private sector needs to respond in such a way to create a built environment that speaks to the needs and the objectives of the state, and also bring in there what academia think how the world should be run. So I think that the way we've done things in the past, Port Elizabeth and Nelson Mandela Bay hasn't seen much of them, but the waterfront in Cape Town, I think that kind of thing will probably be something of the past, not only in South Africa, but the whole world. I think places like Melrose Arch, which creates islands of severe Western sophistication, might be something of the past. So I think we need to think differently about the role of the state and the private sector, and I think that thought or idea will be reinforced by the present economic recession. Planning needs to be done differently, and then you'll find that architecture and urban design will also start thinking differently and how to respond to the market out there. I'm not going to go much into that slide, but I think the main objective is to use urban regeneration, what we do urban planning or urban renewal, to create a kind of place, dynamic places that will respond to the marketplace out there. And I know I feel intimidated too with Professor Rashmi, who often phones me and tells me how bad we are and how good we are. But that kind of call is important to me because he's an academic, he spent many years in academia, and when he gives me a clap over the head, I'll be really silly to sit back and say, stuff you, I'll do it my own way. He actually played a big role in making us think differently and not to ignore academia, but bring it into that equation of private sector and public sector. Just that slide, and I want to just spend some time on it. And sometimes we talk about planning and we talk about architecture and urban design, but we often must ask ourselves, what could this city really be? What is the cluster or the area of economics where the city can actually grow? But if you look at that slide there, we haven't got much of a primary industry in Port Elizabeth. The blue slide is what we call the primary industry, which is mining. We haven't got mining. But even if we had mining, mining is extremely volatile. It goes up and down like you wouldn't believe it. If it goes well, it goes well. If it goes badly, it goes very badly. The red line is the secondary industry, which is motor manufacturing. Again, this city is built on motor manufacturing. When it comes into a recession, we're all conking, we all cry and run into our corners and start thinking, oh hell, what now? The sector that carries itself the best worldwide, even in terms of recession, is the tertiary sector, which is the sector of tourism real estate. So it's not tourism per se, It's not lots of Dutch people and German people arriving with big bags of euros. It actually is that sector that caters first for the local population, and then, as we say, you play tennis, the craftsman will come later, and you create a place for foreigners as well. So I believe that when it comes to planning and architecture, we first must say, what are we planning for? What kind of economic sector do we need to build? And the only sector that shows real room for improvement and building in the Nelson Mandela Bay is the tourism real estate sector, which is the tertiary sector. So that third way we apply in a not such a successful way, we're doing okay, I think, is to reorganize areas, to do a bit of slum clearing, to give new birth, to break new ground, and to refashion. And I think we are very much in the practice of dynamic place initiative, to create dynamic places. I think King's Beach has become a dynamic place after being dead for many, many years. I think that Donkin has become a dynamic place. But I honestly believe that those dynamic places cannot come effectively to the fore if it hasn't got that strong collaboration between the private sector, the public sector, and particularly academia. And I'm hoping that this kind of conference will increase that influence of academia in what we do. So we're practicing a bit of a new model in bringing those three sectors together, or those three disciplines, private sector, public sector, and academia. And I think we use economics and innovation theory to understand urban development against the backdrop of creating those dynamic places. And I think it's important not to forget the state's objectives. The state has got some serious objectives, we can't ignore it. They need to increase the GDP, but they need to increase that GDP with the job creation going along with it. Planning on construction of problematic activities and economic and social generation is more complex though. So I think that one needs to find the avenues to create a system, a focal point where you can bring those three areas together, private sector and public sector and academia. And I need to start thinking about new urban planning economic context, and I often refer it to as sport tourism, a new economy, and I think that we're sometimes lagging behind in that idea. Some of us still think in a very, very Western way, and I am one of them. And I need to force myself sometimes to say and sit back and say, Pierre, who are you working for? And what are you supposed to do? Pierre, who is your customer out there? And the customer out there, I'm afraid, we have 80%, 90% of people that need to see things differently and do things differently, and we need to design differently for those people out there. So I believe that the art or the discipline or the science of urban planning needs to be much more economic growth orientated. It's a very, very powerful tool to create that economic growth and job creation. What we have done over the last couple of years, I think, is a very interventionist approach. I think we've been very much in practice, we've been doing it. It's not been easy, and if you see the paper's front page this morning, it becomes even more difficult. We try and speak to those social needs out there through the disciplines of urban planning, design, and architecture. I think society needs to be more involved in urban planning. Now, in South Africa, we have a great constitution. We say we must talk to the people out there. We say we must talk to the customers. But do we? How many of our urban designs in South Africa are really a true reflection of the needs of people? It's difficult though. You spend a lot of money on public participation in design processes, calling people into meetings and asking them, what do you want? What do you feel is more appropriate for your area? And I think our upgrade now will start beginning of next year of Sangapi Road is a very good reflection of talking to people first. It took us a year and a half to get to the point of the final design. We didn't see that design in Tel Aviv or Vancouver or in Cape Town or in Amsterdam. That design is a homegrown design coming from the people. Society needs to be more involved in planning and architecture and urban design. In short, I think other than making political and social sense, urban planning, I suppose architecture and design must make economic and financial sense. And I think our little funny company, there isn't much or many other examples such as us in South Africa, is probably a conduit between the state and the private sector and academia, and becomes a key tool ensuring that urban planning makes political, social, and economic sense. Just quickly, a couple of slides on what we have done thus far. We have done a master plan for our area. It's been tedious, it's been difficult, it's been updated. We have not only looked at what we saw in our books of theory, our theoretical books. We didn't go back only to academia, but we did some market research and tried to see what does this economy want. We tried to look at office gaps or office market gaps, retail gaps, residential gaps, and also that last very important part, the tourism market, leisure and sports market. And we tried to reflect that into a master plan, creating certain nodes. Some of these nodes are completed, some will be completed in the future. I think one important node is Route 67, which has become a very big part of Port Elizabeth or Nelson Mandela Bay's tourism real estate. We're now busy with the bargains, and I think the 40 million rand investment in the tramway building is locked down today and tomorrow. I hope to solve that today. That 40 million rand is not only an investment into a building, it's an investment in a complete new tourism real estate node. And in that creation of that node, architecture and urban design will play an extremely important role in speaking to the needs of the marketplace out there. So in a way, we have put money into specific areas already. We've invested thus far around 500 million rand into specific nodes. And in a way, we're building a puzzle bit by bit by bit. And through that design process, architecture process, speaking to the marketplace, we create an economic impact not only on that specific site, but in the whole area around that site. All those projects have been completed. I'm not going to go too much into them, but I think I'm trying to prove a point that eventually that urban design and that architecture and that planning needs to transpire into positive economic development for the broad market out there. That's the node I've just been talking about. The new development at the new bridge is important. It created the start of something new, and I think our investment into the tramway building will create a completely new node that will speak to the needs of tourism real estate. Key findings. It's important to test what you are doing, and to me it's very, very important. Are we on the right track, or are we doing something very wrong? And I can assure you my presentations of the stuff that we've done wrong will probably be much longer than this one, but I'm not going to refer to that. So we've done a survey amongst businesses. This is an important statistic to me. 78% of businesses surveyed had made improvements to their premises in the last 5 years. In the time of recession, that's important. Maybe a layer of paint, it may be additions, it may be renovations. The second part is very important. 70% indicated in these improvements that they were the result of the MBA upgrades. That is speaking to the marketplace. Now that 70% should be 80%, maybe 90%. So you need to do something that makes economic sense and speak to the marketplace out there. We're busy building a puzzle. The puzzle was only around the CBD, and I think we got many things wrong, but I think we also got many things right. And I think that puzzle is now starting to get together and forming a very good basis for tourism real estate. Our work has expanded now to townships, and I must say to you, this is extremely rewarding work to me personally, but it's extremely, extremely difficult. Yesterday we opened the Bentonville Resource Centre, built at a cost of 38 million rand, but you find a very strong positive part of the community, but also another very negative part of the community who feel that they haven't been part of the building of that centre. And also those social needs needs to be addressed through the urban planning and urban design process. Just a little slide or two about what we do, and I put this slide up about Sangabi Road because Sangabi Road will not only be the upgrade of a road, it will also be an upgrade of a complete precinct. It will include lots of art, it will include lots of parks, and it will be a lovely entrance to an award-winning museum. I think many people driving the road at the moment probably turn around and say, look, we don't want to go to this museum because it looks bad. And hopefully in 3 years' time, you'll find a very, very strong urban upgrade. Just quickly on the port, that was our dream initially, to remove the tank farm and the manganese facility. But we moved to the next one, and that point 4 there on the right-hand side will be the new, what we call marina commercial development. It's all in place, there's no doubt about it. And even there, the planning of that number 4, that blue area on the right-hand side, needs to reflect the needs of the community in Nelson Mandela Bay first. And I think that the urban planning process becomes so much more important, and the architecture, to get that part right. And I think the role of the private sector and the role of academia will be very, very important. The RFP will be released towards the end of this month, beginning of next month, mid-November, and I hope that we get it right. Because colleagues, if you don't get this kind of thing right from the start, you can never fix it again. You need to speak to the community out there, and you need to reflect to the marketplace out there. Just the final slide, and then I will field some questions. But I want to ask you that if you look at that competitiveness diagram, is Nelson Mandela Bay a competitive city? And if you take motor manufacturing and related industry out of that diagram, you're probably going to find that every single square there will be red. We're not getting it right. In a way, we are competitive in motor manufacturing and related industries, but we're extremely competitive, uncompetitive in anything else. And I think that if you start building a tourism real estate sector through creative urban design and architecture and urban planning, speaking to the needs of the marketplace, I think not in the next 30 years, but I think in the next 6, 7 to 8 years, one can create a very, very powerful tourism real estate sector. I cannot think that happening without the very proactive participation of the state, and particularly the private sector and academia, and I think that the art of planning and architecture is a crucial part in creating these very dynamic public spaces. I want to thank you very, very much. It's a bit of a difficult day for me, but it's always nice to talk to you, and as I said to you, it's not a planner talking, it's not an architect talking, not an engineer, just a common open speaks right from the heart of the marketplace. Thank you very much.